Welcome, everybody. We're going to take another minute or two to let everybody get into the webinar, then we'll get started. Folks are still joining us. We'll just give it one more minute. Okay, I think we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's Public Funds, Public Schools webinar, Fighting Voucher Legislation in 2021, an update on state voucher bills and tools to oppose them. I'm Sharon Krangle, Policy and Outreach Director at Education Law Center, and ELC is partners with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the SPLC Action Fund on the Public Funds, Public Schools campaign, which works to ensure that all public funds for education are used to maintain and support public schools using multiple strategies, including litigation, advocacy, and research. So first, some webinar housekeeping. This webinar is part of our ongoing series and it's being recorded. You can find links to all of our webinars on our website, which is pfps.org, under the advocacy section on the site. While you're on the website, be sure to sign up for the PFPS distribution list to get updates from our team, including about future webinars. And during today's webinar, please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. PFPS put together this webinar in response to the significant number of private school voucher bills that have already been introduced in 2021 in state legislatures across the country. Our panelists are going to talk about these bills and the tools and resources our organizations can offer advocates working to protect public education. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about today's panelists, and then we will get started. Carol Burris is the Executive Director of the Network for Public Education and its related organization, the Network for Public Education Action. Prior to joining NPE, Carol served as a school board member, taught at both the middle and high school level, and was the principal of Southside High School in New York. In 2013, she was named the New York State Principal of the Year. She has a doctorate from Teachers College, Columbia University, and is the author of 3 books on equitable practices in schools. Catherine Dunn is a regional policy analyst at the SPLC Action Fund and part of the PFPS campaign. Nicole Chulo is a research and policy associate at Education Law Center and part of the PFPS campaign. And Elise Aguilar is federal policy counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a nonpartisan educational and advocacy organization dedicated to advancing the separation of religion and government. Elise helps manage Americans United's role as co-chair of the National Coalition for Public Education, a coalition that supports public funding for public education and opposes private school vouchers. And PFPS is a member of NCPE. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carol.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I'm going to kick us off with some background information about vouchers for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with them. And I think that their history is very relevant to what's happening today. American school voucher programs resulted from two events that were occurring simultaneously in the 1950s. The first was the mandate to integrate schools via Brown versus the Board of Education. And the second was the introduction of the very concept of a voucher by libertarian economist Milton Friedman. Now, after Brown v. Board in 1954, Southern states actively resisted desegregation. Part of that resistance was the establishment of private segregation academies across the South. For example, in Prince Edward County in Virginia, people defied the Brown decision by closing the entire public school system and diverting public education funds into voucher tuition grants that white parents could use in the town's segregated private academy. Black students were denied access to education in that county for 5 years until the public schools were finally forced to reopen by the courts. Now, in the midst of all of this turmoil and shocking defiance of the law across the South, enters libertarian economist Milton Friedman, who in 1955 wrote an essay entitled "The Role of Government in Education." Friedman is well aware of the controversy regarding segregation academies in the South, and in his essay, he addresses it by saying that schools should not be forced to segregate, but neither should they be forced to desegregate. In other words, in his school marketplace, segregation is okay. He coins the term voucher and then defines it this way. Governments could require a minimum level of education, which they could finance by giving parents vouchers, redeemable for a specified maximum sum per child per year if spent on approved educational services. The educational services could be rendered by private enterprises, operated for profit, or by nonprofit institutions of various kinds. Friedman was also the first to use the term government schools when referring to public schools. Now, for a long time, vouchers did not have popular support, likely because of the association between vouchers and segregation academies. However, Friedman's ideas did not go away. They have been incubating in right-wing and libertarian think tanks, like Michigan's Mackinac Center. In 1999, the center published The Origins of Government Education in the United States, which refers to PTAs and school boards as government school associations. It was a very clever move. Wherever the word public appeared, they would substitute the word government. So how did this unpopular idea, associated with a shameful time in American history, become mainstream? Joseph Overton was the senior vice president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy during the 1990s. He is most known for the idea of the Overton window, a means by which to analyze and rebrand extreme policies in order to make them more acceptable to the public. According to Overton, only those policies identified as in the window are politically possible. Therefore, if one wishes to make the unacceptable acceptable, the solution is to shift the window. So how is that done with vouchers? Overton's example to illustrate the movement of the voucher window is the changed public perception of school choice that came about because of charter schools. In the 1980s, advocating for charter schools was politically dangerous. As charter schools became more acceptable, however, so did the idea of school choice, which in turn allowed conservative politicians to advocate for taxpayer-funded homeschooling, private school tax credits, and charter expansion, including for-profit charter chains, and of course, advocating for vouchers. So this brings us to today. As you'll learn during this webinar, this year, in addition to voucher bills, we are also seeing for the first time comprehensive school choice bills, like the Missouri Senate bill that not only establishes a voucher program, but also expands charter schools and has components that are hostile to school boards. A bill being pushed forward in Iowa would not only establish a voucher program, but also take charter school decisions away from districts and give it to the State House as well. As you listen today, it's important that you understand the long-term goal. It was expressed by Friedman 64 years ago. Minimum requirements to educate kids, parents getting a fixed amount from the government, which may go up or may go down depending upon who is in power, parents shopping and undoubtedly supplementing with their own funds tuition for better schools, and in the case of private schools, parents hoping that the school accepts their child. This has always been the goal, the destruction of community-governed public schools. And now Catherine is going to explain more about what is happening now.
Thanks so much, Carol, for grounding us in that history and giving a little context for where we are today. So I wanted to start with what we mean when we say vouchers. Today's vouchers come in a variety of different forms. Generally, though, they are redirecting public funds to private educational uses. About 30 states have some type of voucher. The list you see here is definitely not an exhaustive list. Vouchers come in many forms and they're constantly evolving. That is part of the strategy of privatizers. But just to define a couple of the most common types of vouchers, traditional private school vouchers pay for all or part of a student's private school tuition with direct payments from a public treasury. States who enact these types of vouchers may impose student eligibility requirements, limits on voucher amounts, and or conditions on private schools receiving vouchers. A second common type of voucher is a tax credit voucher. These types of vouchers provide individuals or corporations with up to 100% dollar for dollar tax credit to send what they would otherwise owe in taxes to private organizations that then distribute private school vouchers to pay for students' K-12 tuition. And then the third type of pretty common voucher is an education savings account voucher. We'll probably refer to them throughout today's webinar as ESA vouchers. These are public funds, generally a percentage of the amount provided by the state to each public school for each student that are deposited into a personal account that can be used to pay for a student's private school tuition, but also other private expenses such as tutoring, online coursework, transportation, and homeschooling. ESA vouchers are definitely one of the biggest trends we're seeing this year in 2021, although we're also seeing some hybrids of the vouchers listed on the screen, but all of these types of vouchers are vouchers. Next screen. So why are these bills and proposals a problem? The first, I think, foundation is that, public education is the cornerstone of American democracy. We at PFPS believe all students deserve access to a thriving public school in their neighborhood. And advocacy is definitely critical to ensuring that public schools do offer a space that supports and nurtures all children and that they have the resources they need to meet the needs of all students. But public schools must be open to all and they're accountable to their communities that they serve. On the other hand, research has shown that vouchers do not improve outcomes for students and they do not benefit communities. Study after study shows that students using vouchers fare worse academically than students in public schools. This is found true in voucher programs in Louisiana, Indiana, and DC, and across the country. Voucher programs undermine public schools that are already under-resourced, and many, of course, are facing threats of additional cuts now due to the pandemic. They result in increased segregation. As Carol noted, these programs grew out of resistance to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but they continue this harmful legacy today through increased segregation. They also erode the separation of church and state, and they lack accountability and transparency, as found in study after study as well. Vouchers also allow for publicly funded discrimination. Students often lose rights when taking a voucher, including rights for students with disabilities, students of color, and LGBTQ students. This is an especially troubling aspect of vouchers because proponents will often co-opt civil rights language. Even former President Trump championed vouchers as the civil rights issue of our time. This discrimination can show up in the admissions process, which students can or can't attend a certain private school, in lack of protections for students once they're enrolled in a private voucher school. Many explicitly ban LGBTQ students. Rebecca Klein at Huffington Post has done great reporting on how curriculum in these schools is often racist, anti-science, anti-democratic, and anti-multicultural, including textbooks in private voucher schools that dismiss evolution as junk science and characterize Nelson Mandela as a Marxist agitator. Next slide. PFPS has been tracking these bills for several years. Dozens of bills tend to be introduced, although there was a trend in decline of voucher bills, but only a handful have been passing in recent years. This year looks different. A variety of factors, principally the pandemic being used opportunistically while students are not in person in school, have led to an onslaught of private school voucher bills in 2021. We're not seeing a groundswell of calls for vouchers. Many of these proposals actually lack bipartisan support. We know families and communities value their public schools, and polling hasn't seen that shift over the course of the pandemic. A number of bills that we're seeing, some that potentially have momentum this year, are recycled from previous years where they were not successful. A few hot spots that we're watching include Arizona, where even after voters overwhelmingly rejected a 2018 effort to expand eligibility for Arizona's voucher program, it lost at the ballot box. Thanks to the leadership of SOS Arizona and others, legislators have continued to introduce bills to dramatically expand the state's voucher programs against public will. Florida is a state where we already send more public money than any other state to private schools, about $1 billion a year. And there's a bill right now that passed out of committee yesterday that merges several of its vouchers and proposes an ESA type voucher that would vastly expand the private uses that the funds can be used for with minimal standards and would increase the funds diverted. In Georgia, 3 separate bills, 2 expanding existing voucher programs and 1 establishing a new ESA voucher that has several eligibility criteria, including that a student's school is not fully open for in-person learning due to the pandemic. Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, Southern Education Foundation, and the Georgia Coalition for Public Education and others are doing great work on this bill, but it's clearly tied to the pandemic and is seen as an opportunity to get this legislation that had failed in previous years passed. In New Hampshire, Republicans newly gained a majority in the state's legislature and are pushing proposals that also haven't passed before to enact ESA vouchers. Although thousands of concerned community members showed up in a virtual committee this week, more than 3,000 attendees said they opposed the bill, while only 600 said that they support it. Again, a sign that there is not a groundswell of support for these programs, and reaching higher. New Hampshire and others are doing great work to fight that bill in that state. So what can you do in the face of all of these bills? Next slide. Well, you can watch your state for voucher bills. PFPS tracks voucher bills in states across our country on our website, and includes a variety of resources to use to fight private school vouchers. Nicole and I are gonna take you through the bill tracker and then some of our other assets on our website. Nicole, I'll pass it to you to start with the bill tracker.
Hi, everyone. I'm just trying to get my bearings to get out of this and back into Zoom.
Thank you, Nicole, for handling all the screen sharing.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so on the PFPS website, which is www.pfps.org, you can access the PFPS bill tracker, which is the first publicly available nationwide voucher bill tracker. You can get to it through 2 different ways. The first is here on the bill tracker tag on the main navigation bar. and you can access it on the bottom of the homepage. So I'm actually going to start showing and demonstrating on this one. Okay, so on this bill tracker, you see a national map of voucher bills across the country. So the red circles represent states where only one voucher bill has been introduced since PFPS started tracking voucher bills on the website in 2019. So the default map and tracker is going to be from 2019 to 2021. The blue circles represent states where multiple voucher bills have been introduced. So this is like a really good way to get a national look at what's been going on. And so let's say you are interested specifically in 2021 bills. As we're discussing on this webinar, you can go to the year field, filter down to 2021, and then search for bills. As you see here, the map is now changed to only reflect the current legislative session, and this list of bills on the side have also changed to match the 2021 bills. You're also able to use the tracker to search for keywords. So let's say, for example, you're interested in tax credit vouchers during the 2021 legislative session. You can enter that as a keyword and then search for the bills. And now you'll have a list of all of the tax credit vouchers that have that in either the summary or the bill title. You can also use the clear all filters to default back to the original search, and then you don't have to keep refreshing your web page in order to go back and start a new search. So another thing I want to show is how to look for a bill specifically to a state. So as Catherine mentioned, one of the hotspots we're watching is Florida. So I'm going to select Florida as my state. And because I'm interested in bills from this legislative session, I'm going to select 2021 and then search for the bills. So thus far, PFPS has tracked 3 bills in the Florida legislature. And then you can get more information about the individual bill by clicking on the bill number on the side. As soon as you click on the bill number, you'll get a very brief profile of the state, including its summary and its status. And then you have this option to view the bill, which will bring you to a more comprehensive profile of the bill. That's pulled from Legiscan, the legislative service that PFPS uses to track bills. On the summary tab, you'll have a brief description of the bill, as well as a bill type, some categories, which I will go over in a bit, and a few other pieces of information. This comprehensive profile will also have these tabs on the top that you can see the last actions and statuses, the sponsors of the bill, and you have the option to view the bill text. So if you copy this URL here and paste it into your web browser, which I'm not going to do at this second, it will take you directly to the Legiscan website where you'll have access to the bill language and text. There's also a few other tabs that will show you additional information about the bill. So, definitely check it out and feel free to play around with it. I want to go back to the summary tab for a second to look at this categories right here. So PFPS makes an effort to go through all of the bills and assign some topics and tags to it that will tell you the type of voucher as well as some main aspects of the bill to just kind of give a shorthand snapshot of what a bill is about. And PFPS will also update the description, which so a PFPS summary as the bill is noting, as the bill is moving. So as the bill is moving out of committee, PFPS will denote PFPS summary and do a new version of the summary that will include additional information about the type of bill and some other aspects, just to give a more clear idea of what is going on. So the bill tracker is updated once a week, typically on Fridays. And we ask that you check back to get up-to-date information on all of these aspects. And if you see a bill that is not listed here that you know about in your state, we do ask that you email us at info@pfps.org and send us information about the bill. If you have a link to it or any context, that would be great, so we can make sure that the bill tracker is as up-to-date as possible. And the only other thing I want to show is If you go to this bill tracker link on the main navigation bar, instead of just going the way I went on the homepage, you won't have access to that map feature, but you will have a list of the states and where the bills are being introduced. Similar to the homepage, the default here is all of the bills that PFPS has tracked since beginning to use this software. So if you're only interested in 2021 bills, you can set it there and search, and then you'll have the most up-to-date for the 2020-2021 bills. And this list is very comprehensive. The bills on here are not only bills that will establish new voucher programs, but also bills for other diversions of funds for private school expenses. So if the list looks a little long, they're not just changes and expansions in programs.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'll just go over a couple of other resources that are perhaps slightly less exciting than the bill tracker, which I think is really cool, but I'm a nerd. So we have on our advocacy page a fact sheet series that is intended to be useful for folks who are doing this advocacy in their states. We have one on the research on the negative impacts of vouchers, covering some of the topics that I outlined about what research shows about private school vouchers. We have one on the myths of cost savings of vouchers. This is a line that we hear from voucher proponents, from privatizers quite often. And so we go over the research on that myth. And we have one on why vouchers for private virtual education are not a good use of public funds, with more to come. So keep your eye out for additional fact sheets. If you are on our email list, you'll get notified as more fact sheets roll out. You can also find on this advocacy page our past webinars on a range of topics, including an in-depth discussion on ESA vouchers, particularly relevant this legislative session, and a variety of other topics. We have policy briefs, and on our separate pages, we have a research page that summarizes recent studies about vouchers. So you can find the studies linked here, and you can also find concise summaries of what they find. On our litigation page, you can find recent updates about litigation challenging voucher programs, some of which is brought by the PFPS team. And this is another talking point you can use in your advocacy, as many of these programs do end up in court. The final thing to plug is to reach out to these panelists as you're doing this work. We're here to strategize with you and connect you with allies. And we're here to help think about how to either defeat bills or limit their harm in the case that a voucher bill is absolutely on the fast track. Voucher bills present racial justice, disability justice, gender justice, and other education justice issues. And broad-based coalitions are critical to maintaining and strengthening our public schools and opposing vouchers. And so we look forward to working with you all, and thanks for the work that you all do in your states. I'm going to turn it over now to Elise, who certainly has a lot of leadership in the coalition space to fight private school vouchers. Hey, Elise.
Thanks, Catherine. So we've heard from Carol and Catherine and Nicole today about the voucher legislation that's moving across the country. So I'm here to share with you yet another resource, in addition to the wonderful resources Catherine just shared, that we hope will be helpful to you in pushing back against all of these voucher bills. Today, I'm here representing the National Coalition for Public Education. We're a coalition that consists of more than 50 national organizations, including education, civic, civil rights, disability rights, religious and secular organizations, and so many more that all come together on one issue, which is supporting the use of public funds for public schools and opposing funneling taxpayer money to private and religious schools through private school voucher schemes. All of us here on this panel are members of NCPE, and it's such a pleasure to partner with all of you. NCPE generally works at the federal level, as opposed to, I know today we're really focusing on the states, but we do our work mostly at the federal level, opposing voucher policies in Congress or through executive actions. Some of our current top priorities are opposing legislation that would divert COVID relief funding away from public schools to fund private school education or to prop up state voucher programs. advocating for an end to the federally funded DC school voucher program, and opposing the creation of any other federally funded voucher program or tax incentive for private education. But after the Supreme Court's decision in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue this past June, as a coalition, we really recognized that the push for voucher programs was really about to heat up in the states this year. So to that end, we created a resource, a toolkit for legislators and advocates that provides information about the Supreme Court's decision and what it means for private school vouchers across the states. So before I launch into the toolkit in a little bit more detail, I just wanted to take a moment and talk briefly about the Espinoza case and what the decision means. First, I'll start with a little bit of background. The case is about Montana's tax credit voucher program. Montana, like the majority of states across this country, has a constitution that contains a provision known as a no aid clause, which prohibits the use of tax dollars to support religious education. This provision protects both religious freedom and public schools by ensuring that taxpayer dollars fund public, not private religious education. After Montana's legislature passed the tax credit voucher program in 2015, Montana's Department of Revenue stepped in at that point and adopted a regulation to limit the voucher program to secular private schools only, so that the voucher program would not violate the state's constitutional no aid provision. At that point, parents of students attending religious private schools then challenged the regulation because they wanted to be able to use their vouchers for their children to attend religious schools. Even though the Montana Supreme Court struck down the entire voucher program in 2018, the case was appealed all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court issued an opinion last year, which held that the state of Montana could not refuse to fund religious schools in its voucher program, even despite its no aid clause, because that would be discrimination based on a school's religious status. The court said that if a state creates a private school voucher program, it must allow private religious schools to participate along with private secular schools. So what really is the impact of this case? Well, it's important to note that nothing in the court's decision requires states to create new voucher programs or maintain existing ones. The decision also leaves the door open for states to be able to restrict public funding for religious activities, and it did not address whether states can still limit funding for schools that engage in discrimination. The decision makes clear that a state does not need to subsidize private education at all. States are free to fully restrict their public funds solely for public education. Yet, because many states have historically been deterred from passing voucher programs or have had their voucher programs challenged based on their constitutional no aid clauses, this decision now is emboldening legislators and voucher advocates to push for bills to create or expand private school voucher programs. So in order to push back on misleading rhetoric that the Supreme Court decision somehow requires states to fund voucher programs, which it does not, or that it nullifies all state no aid provisions, which it does not, we wanted to create a toolkit that would really set out what the decision means and what the impact is. At this point, Nicole, would you mind sharing your screen so we can show folks how to access the toolkit? Great, thank you so much. So as you can see, this is our NCPE Coalition website, which is ncpecoalition.org or novouchers.org. And as you can see, there's a big purple button in the middle of the homepage that says download our new toolkit. That's the toolkit there. We make it very easy to find. So if you take the time to download the toolkit, you'll see that it contains a really comprehensive set of resources. We wanted this to be everything you ever needed or wanted to know or didn't know you needed or wanted to know about Espinoza and private school vouchers. Some of the sections you can see here inside the toolkit. In the table of contents, you can see there is a section about information about what the Espinoza decision means, similar to what I just shared. There's a more in-depth backgrounder on state constitutional no aid provisions, and there's a full list of states and their provisions there. There are talking points on opposing private school vouchers generally, which focuses on the problems inherent to voucher programs. For example, how voucher programs fail to produce better outcomes for students, how they violate principles of religious freedom and fund discrimination, similar to the talking points that Catherine shared earlier. There are also points on how voucher programs are particularly harmful for students who are most in need of greater resources, like students with disabilities and students living in rural areas. We also have talking points specifically on why you should oppose pandemic funding for private school vouchers, because we know that is something that has momentum at the moment. There's also a section on common legislation legislative pitfalls for a list of state referenda demonstrating how many times vouchers have been voted down by voters across the states. Again, proving that voucher programs, while they might have legislative advocates, they don't necessarily have the public support. I wanted to thank especially Public Funds, Public Schools for their partnership in creating this toolkit. And I also wanted to mention my colleague at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Nick Nardowitz, who's our state policy counsel. And he really helped in creating so much of the content in this toolkit, as well as he is the one at Americans United who works on the state legislation and a lot of the state bills to create or expand private school voucher programs that have been mentioned already. His contact information will be on the final slide. Finally, I just wanted to note that the NCPE website contains a lot of resources aside from this toolkit that we hope will be really helpful to you. I'd like to specifically direct you to the resources page, which you can find at the top. We have a lot of tabs at the top under Learn More. If you click on that, you can see we have About Us, we have types of vouchers legislation, and if you go to Learn More, you'll see the resources that we have there. Many of the talking points that I already mentioned in the toolkit are found here. There are fact sheets, there are studies, summaries of studies, recent letters and statements from the coalition are all here. In addition, we highlight, of course, all the current federal voucher legislation and also recent news and reports. And also, if you check out our letters, you can really get a good sense of our coalition and the wide variety of organizations that are members. So I hope that you will use this as a resource. We think it provides a lot of information similar to the PFPS website that can really be helpful to you. So thank you so much for sharing these resources. Nicole, thank you for your help. And I think now it's time for me to turn it back over to Carol.
Thank you. So then the question becomes, well, what can you do to stop vouchers? You can know about them and you can have the toolkit and the resources, but unless you speak out, unless you let your representatives know that you are not interested in a voucher program in your state and that you support its public schools, well, it's all for nothing. And that pushback we've seen in states over the years really makes a difference. So one of the things that the Network for Public Education through its C4, the Network for Public Education Action, is doing is we started a page where we can give you up-to-date information about the bills, links to the bills, and then also a little bit of a summary so you don't have to go through the bills to understand them yourself. And we really thank our partners for having the bill tracker and keeping us informed. And we need you to keep us all informed as well. Then when we start to see a bill move and we think it's important for people to speak out, what we do is we have actions that you can take part in. If you notice underneath Florida, for example, there's a button that says click to take action here. If you go ahead and click on that button, thanks. That'll take you to another page or to an action where it will tell you who to call, who to send an email to, and what to say when you're on the phone or when you're writing to a legislator. We're going to do our very, very best to always keep this up to date. And again, anyone who's watching, please shoot me an email. You can use my personal email, which is very easy, burriscarol@gmail.com. And let me know what's happening. And make a note, please, of the URL that's on the top. If we could go back to the last page. Thank you. And make sure that you check it. You check it every couple of days. What we always do as well, in addition to posting it, is we take the information, we put it into an email, and we send it to our members who live in that particular state. We have about 350,000 people on our mailing list. So chances are in your state, there's going to be, no matter how small, at least 3,000 or 4,000 people who'll be willing to take action along with you. Thank you. And now I think we're ready for questions and answers.
We are. And we have a number of them. So we are just going to dive right in. And just a reminder that if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many as we can. So the first one, actually, two people wrote questions that are just about the same. So one says, please discuss the arrival of Miguel Cardona at the US DOE. What hopes and fears about vouchers and charters do you anticipate? And sort of along the same lines, there's a question that reads like this. Do the only strategies to reverse these efforts around vouchers exist at the state level, or can the federal government under a new administration take any action that would overrule the states who continue to expand voucher and ESA programs? And that's for everybody.
Well, I'll be happy to talk a little bit about Miguel Cardona. I listened to the hearing yesterday. I did not hear any kind of support for voucher programs. He received, I think, about 2 or 3 questions on the subject. Regarding charters, he said that he understands there are excellent charter schools, but he also made it very, very clear that his efforts are going to be focused on neighborhood, what he called neighborhood public schools, to make sure that all of them are excellent. The federal government doesn't have much of a role in terms of vouchers, even though they certainly, the last administration tried to push them forward. But I think I'd like to punt that one to Catherine and see if she can share any information that she has.
Absolutely, and I'll lean on Elise too, because like she mentioned, their work is so focused on the federal level. I think the one federally funded voucher program is the DC voucher program. And so I think folks are optimistic, given Cardona's deep support for public schools, that he will end that program and of course oppose any additional diversions of public funds to private schools. One thing that we're watching is how the federal coronavirus relief funds will be handled in terms of diversions to private schools. And so we're hopeful that new packages that come out do keep public funds in public schools that are really struggling to reopen during COVID and have the resources that they need to keep all students and staff safe. Elise's coalition recently led a letter actually directing, bringing some recommendations at the federal level around vouchers. So is there anything you want to lift up from that letter? We can share a link to it in the chat as well, Elise.
Sure, that would be great. Yeah, I think I echo the sentiments about soon to be, hopefully, Secretary Cardona, that he has a strong foundation in public education and that we are hopeful he will be an advocate for public schools and not want to divert resources to private schools through voucher programs. I think one of the things about Secretary DeVos is that she was largely unsuccessful in pushing forward her desire for federally funded vouchers. As Catherine mentioned, we do have the federally funded DC voucher program, which pre-exists her, and that a lot of the push for creating a federally funded tax credit voucher program, which would have had an impact in the states, that has been unsuccessful. It does not have wide support in Congress. There will always be members of Congress who are proposing that and championing that, but it does not have broad enough support to pass on its own. So there are ways that she was sort of tinkering at the margins, I would say, putting school choice language where she could into federally funded grant programs and things like that. So we're hopeful that under a new administration, that type of those types of actions will be limited and that we will not see further privatization schemes crop up. We're also hopeful that the next funding, as Catherine mentioned, that's another place where school privatization vouchers can come up for the COVID relief funding package. We're hopeful that the next package will focus on funding our public schools, and we certainly advocate to keep it that way and to not divert funding to private schools through voucher programs or through any type of incentive to support private education through that mechanism. I think aside from what was mentioned already, preventing COVID relief funding for private schools, preventing any expansion of the DC voucher program. And in fact, we'd love to see the program ended. Those are really our top priorities at the moment at the federal level.
Thanks. So here's another question for everybody. The question reads, how do you explain the fact that vouchers are overwhelmingly popular, yet states are being inundated with them?
Well, I guess
I think it's, yeah.
Overwhelmingly unpopular with whom? This is really the question. The states are being inundated with them now because the last election was very different. When you take a look at the election of the president and then you take a look at who was elected in state houses. And in state houses, there a lot of Republican majorities were cemented, and some even became supermajorities. So that gave an opening. And many of the people who fund some of the folks who run, like the DeVos family, like the Koch brothers, or brother at this point, are very vested into this idea of a privatized system. So people, I think, these legislators are just hoping by making this a priority, by putting all of these bills in quickly, by building on a lot of dissatisfaction with parents. That's understandable because of so many schools being closed due to COVID-19, that they have an opening to push the bills through. And then hope that enough people take advantage of it that the bills remain popular.
Anybody else?
No, I was just going to echo what Carol said. I mean, I think it's really follow the money. I think there is, not a lot of bipartisan support, as I mentioned in my presentation, for these proposals. And in fact, the example from New Hampshire, where 3,000 people turned out to oppose a voucher that, does have support from the party in power in that state, I think shows just, how those legislators are not responding to a demand from families, but from other forces.
Great. So another question for everybody. What other organizations are fighting voucher legislation besides PFPS and NPE and NCPE?
Is that a question specifically about state bills or at the federal level? Because I could definitely mention all of the groups that are members of NCPE at the federal level who fight against vouchers. Someone mentioned Pastors for Children in the chat, who is a wonderful state-based, I guess they have chapters in states across the country. So they're a wonderful organization. So is it a state-based question or a federal question?
So the question doesn't have any more details than that. So I think you could take it where you like.
I think there are a lot of grassroots groups who are doing amazing work in opposing vouchers. SOS in Arizona is one that comes to mind. Pastors for Texas Children, Kentucky's Children, Florida's Children. We have at the Network for Public Education, if you go to that C3 site, a grassroots groups coalition. There are about, I think right now, about 130 members. I bet you every single one of those groups also are opposed to vouchers, and many of the local groups are actively fighting them.
Yeah, I'll add that, be in touch with us if you, need connections in your states. That's a lot of the role that we see PFPS and our partners here to play is, helping connect you with folks doing this work in your states. The national NAACP partnered with PFPS to challenge one of DeVos's attempts to channel public money to private schools last summer. And I know they have chapters in states across the country that are working to fight vouchers, and just really want to lift up how vouchers are an issue that impacts so many issues: racial justice, gender justice, disability justice. And so I think there are a lot of really active folks doing this work, and an opportunity to kind of expand coalitions in our states too, by lifting up the many issues that vouchers present
And I'll just note
children.
too, because we also do work at the state level through Americans United for Separation of Church and State, that we work with a lot of these groups mentioned too, as well as the local and state teachers unions and the ACLUs, and there are other organizations like Carol and Catherine have mentioned too that we partner with. Also wanted just to mention NCPE. If you check out the letter that I posted in the chat, you can see a lot of the groups that we have listed there that are also work at the national and both state levels too. And we also can connect you to those groups. I forgot to mention, if you go to our website, ncpecoalition.org, we have a contact us button too, so you can always reach out to us that way as well.
Great. So we have a number of questions about strategy. So I'm going to put some of this stuff together, and again for all the panelists. So one is, what's the role of ALEC in these voucher bills, and is it useful to push back on these bills by pointing out when they come from ALEC boilerplates? Another is, what could the role be of a school board member or school boards in general around voucher legislation? And then more broadly, what kind of strategies do you suggest if we are actively fighting against a voucher bill?
I can jump in. I don't want to take it away from Catherine and others who work at the state level. But I think just to, I guess, tack on to the last question, which was, how can you fight back against these voucher bills in your state? I think connecting with the local groups as much as possible, making sure that you are, as we talked about, vouchers are being pushed really by pro-voucher advocates and by legislators who don't necessarily speak for the people in their state. We've talked about grassroots organizations like in Arizona that rallied educators and parents and others to demonstrate how much they did not want a voucher program in their state or expanded in their state, connecting with religious groups and others to push back on this rhetoric or this narrative that, that religious organizations want this funding for their schools. I think there's a lot of ways to bring in lots of different voices and speak to how broad the opposition for voucher programs really is.
And some of the resources that I showed you on our webpage are helpful too, where you can kind of just press a button and get ideas. But there is nothing more important than that personal touch, this story where you're calling up a legislator and telling him a story. Maybe it's a story about how a child that was discriminated against in a private school and how we should not be supporting that. Or maybe it's just to talk about how much your public school needs resources and you don't want to see them drained away. Or your deep held belief in the importance and the ideals of public education. All of those things are important. Social media, right? Get together, make a post that you put on your Facebook page or on Twitter, where you're letting your friends know that these are the people to call. This is what they should say. It's amazing what's happened in New Hampshire, where folks have gotten together and have gone via Zoom to these meetings to lodge their protest. It's all about public awareness. School boards, I think, have a critical role to play. It's so important that they let parents know that this is a danger to the schools that they love. As soon-to-be Secretary Cardona said yesterday, most parents' choice is a good local neighborhood public school. And it's really important for parents to start to make that connection that this is a threat to that, and that unless they stand up and speak out, they're apt to lose a lot of funding in the future.
I would just add to all, I think it is the most critical thing is that legislators hear from their constituents about the needs of their, public schools and what students and families want. On our bill tracker, you can follow the status process of a bill. So it's important to get in early so that bills don't get out of committee. And then I would just add, we can strategize with you if bills are moving. I think there are ways to make explicit the discrimination that comes with voucher programs by trying to introduce anti-discrimination measures and kind of call folks pushing voucher programs on the fact that they often resist these non-discrimination requirements flowing with the public money. I think a lot of vouchers get introduced with almost no accountability. And so if something is moving and you can insert things like audits done by the state, that gives you an opportunity to prevent vouchers from growing down the road. Of course, as much as you can stop them from getting enacted in the first place, the better. But there are ways to build in provisions or introduce provisions that call more attention to all of the issues that come with voucher programs. But I think the outreach piece is definitely the most critical.
I think it's also really important to get a good understanding of the different kinds of programs because, go back to that Overton window by giving them names like scholarships, right? Or opportunity. What's happening is that a lot of members of the public really don't even realize what these bills are about. And that is done deliberately. So educating neighbors, educating members of your community, educating the school board as to all of the different forms of vouchers, sometimes they're referred to as neo-vouchers, is a critical, important piece of what's happening. Otherwise, people go, oh, well, what the heck if somebody gets a few $100s to send their kids to a private school? Well, one thing we know, and I think everybody on this webinar would attest, is that with voucher bills, it is always the camel's nose under the tent. We've seen it in Arizona, we've seen it in Florida. So it starts out with vouchers for a very small amount for just a small select group of kids with special needs, children of military families. But then what happens is session after session after session, it expands. It gets larger and larger and larger with the aim in the end of totally privatizing education.
So there's one more question that I'm actually going to answer and then just wrap things up. So the question is, where is an example of a successful opposition effort that overcame voucher expansion, and is it written up anywhere? And I just want to let folks know that another thing that PFPS does each year is a legislative roundup of all the voucher bills that were proposed in state legislatures the prior year and with the results. And you can find on our website the roundup of 2019, and we are in the process of putting the finishing touches on 2020, and that will come out soon. And some of the good news is that for the vast majority of bills, in most cases, these bills don't pass. But anyway, please, look for the 2020 roundup. So Nicole, if you could please put the last slide up, that would be great. And I just want to take a minute to thank our incredible panelists for today and draw your attention to our last slide, Contact Us, which has the ways to contact everybody who is on the panel, as well as the URLs for the various organizations that we are all part of. And you will receive a recording of this webinar, so you don't have to scribble all this down right now. You'll have another chance to see all this. But as Catherine said earlier, we do urge you to be in touch with us, please, about what's going on in your state and any help we can give, et cetera. And I just want to also thank NPE and Carol for co-hosting this webinar with us. We really appreciate it. And thank NCPE as well, and everybody who's been on the panel, and especially everybody who has participated. And please do sign up for PFPS alerts if you and emails if you don't have those already. And there will be more webinars in this series, and we will be sure to let everybody know about that. And please go to the website to access all the tools we talked about. And we appreciate very much your participation today. Thank you.